Welcome back to Face the Nation. We want to go now to former FDA Commissioner Dr. Scott Gottlieb, who is in Westport, Connecticut. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
We have now 8 million infections in the United States, record hospitalizations. In terms of the red zone areas the White House is concerned about, 26 states fall into that category. Where are we headed as a country?
Probably the most difficult phase of this epidemic. I think the next 3 months are going to be very challenging. There's really no backstop against the spread that we're seeing. We're probably 2 or 3 weeks behind Europe, and Europe's in a very difficult position right now, too. I think as we enter the winter, we're going to see continued spread. There's 42 states where hospitalizations are rising. There's 45 states where the rate of transfer, the RT, is above 1, meaning they have expanding epidemics. And there's really no backstop. There's not going to be an intervention that really thwarts this. Short of the ability to get a vaccine, which is probably an event that happens late in next year.
You point out...
I lost my sound.
I can still hear Dr. Gottlieb. I think we're working on being able to reestablish his audio. Dr. Gottlieb, can you hear me? Okay, we're going to work on fixing that and come back to the conversation with Dr. Gottlieb in a moment. But we're going to turn now to another important conversation with the head of one of the 12 banks that make up the Federal Reserve System. That's Raphael Bostic. He joins us from Atlanta this morning. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Margaret.
There was a front page story in the Wall Street Journal just yesterday that pointed to the South, the area of the country you watch most carefully, and said it's been largely unscathed economically by the pandemic. It's got a 6.9% unemployment rate, the lowest of any region as of August. When you look at those numbers, does it vindicate the political decision by governors in the South to go ahead and reopen against the advice of health officials?
Well, Margaret, I don't know that I would say vindicate. As Dr. Gottlieb was just saying, we're still very much in the midst of this crisis. And one of the reasons I think that the South has benefited is because the virus came to us after it had been to California, the West Coast, and New York. And so we got to learn some things about how we might be able to operate and do our economics with the virus with us. And I think that has turned out to be something that's been quite helpful.
Important caveat there. When you look at Atlanta, in particular, I know you've pointed out in recent interviews that eviction levels are higher than where they were a year ago. What are some of the indicators that you are watching that make you concerned rather than optimistic as the White House paints us to be on a clear upwards trajectory?
Well, I'm definitely concerned, and I'm concerned because as I go around and talk to people and businesses in the district, what I see is 2 real stories going on. In some segments, the economy is recovering and rebounding in a very robust way. But in other segments, things like hotels and restaurants, small businesses in particularly minority and lower income communities, those places are seeing much more difficult situations. You know, if you were to graph this, after the great decline that we saw in March and April, the recovery looks something like this, where you have a number of sectors that are going up. This is what I call a less than sign. And in other instances, you're not seeing any recovery at all. And so those segments where we're not seeing that recovery, that's really what I'm concerned about as we move forward.
A disjointed recovery is kind of what you're sketching out there. You know, there was one number that I read about this week that really stood out to me, and I want to share it with you. And it paints this picture of white collar and working class America being on really different trajectories. According to the latest household pulse data, between 7 and 11 million children in this country live in a household where children just didn't eat enough because their household couldn't afford it. This is the richest country in the world. We're being told that the economy is recovering. This doesn't say that to me at all. What does this indicate to you?
Well, first of all, we have to recognize that the issue of food insecurity is something that we've had in this country for a long time. It's not new and it's not just a result of the virus. But what the virus has done, it has put a wedge in our economy. And for all those who have been in more precarious situations, it's made them even more precarious. And so those that have been in distress are in much more distress, while others are not really feeling that at all. And I think it's important to recognize that whatever people are experiencing, there are a lot of other Americans out there who are struggling and are on the edge. And that evictions data is just one example of that.
Black Americans have recovered just over a third of employment that they lost during this pandemic. This speaks to what you're talking about in terms of different experiences. According to the Fed, only 34% of Black households own stocks. You've been writing and speaking a lot lately about widening inequality in this country. What needs to be done about it?
Well, first of all, we have to acknowledge that there's a problem, and we have to be willing to talk about it. You know, my institution has for a long time not been willing to be out in front to talk about the importance of racial inequalities. I actually think that that's been a mistake, and what we're seeing is many more of my colleagues jumping up and being willing to talk about this. In terms of what to do, I think there are two dimensions on this. One is that we have to change the trajectory for the generations to come so that they have good schooling, they have good training, they have real access to capital, and they can progress just like everyone else. But we also have a lot of people today who are trying to benefit from this economy and participate in it. So we need to make sure that we're providing resources and infrastructure to help those people as well.
You know, Joe Biden has been calling for the Fed to start regularly reporting on racial gaps. Your name appeared in a number of reports this week as a potential member of a Biden administration, either as a Treasury Secretary or head of the Federal Reserve. Are those jobs you'd be interested in?
You know, Margaret, there's so much going on right now that I am not thinking about that. I've got a pandemic, I've got an economic crisis, and I've got my own bank to worry about in terms of the policies that we're doing. So I'll let things play out as they will, and we'll just see how that goes.
All right, that's not a no. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bostic. We will be back in a moment. We want to go back now to Dr. Scott Gottlieb. We have fixed that technical issue, we hope. You were just saying, Dr. Gottlieb, but we were headed into a very difficult period. You still predict the vaccine as an event well into 2021. When we look at what's happening right now, there's such an outbreak in the Midwest. In Wisconsin, they had their highest daily case total since the pandemic began on Friday, and residents are being told to avoid crowds. But the president held a rally there just yesterday. He seems to not be adopting any further health restrictions, even after having recovered from the virus himself. How dangerous is this?
I think it's problematic, and I think it's adding to the challenges. Look, the spread we have right now is with the mitigation that we have in place. And so we are taking some steps. If we weren't taking those steps, if people weren't wearing masks generally, and some states weren't adhering to some mitigation tactics, and we weren't testing and tracing, then we'd have much worse spread. And if you look at the White House strategy, they've come out against universal masking. They've come out against testing asymptomatic and mildly symptomatic people. They say testing should be reserved just to the vulnerable. They want businesses and schools reopened, as we all do, and they're against targeted mitigation like closing restaurants. There was criticism of New York when New York kept the restaurants closed. So it begs the question, what is the strategy? And I think the strategy is just to endure the spread until we get to that vaccine. And the reason that's problematic is because even if you get companies filing applications at the end of November, which is what they've said, and I'm on the board of Pfizer, one of the companies developing one of those vaccines, it'll take FDA 2 to 4 weeks to turn that application around. Then it'll take us another 2 to 4 weeks to get the initial tranche of people, the most vulnerable who are indicated for the vaccine, vaccinated. Then they need to get a second dose, and that happens in the next 3 to 4 weeks. And then it takes 2 weeks for the immunity really to kick in. So you're looking at a situation where the first tranche of people to get vaccinated really won't be protected from the vaccine probably till February and maybe March. And so that's a long way off. We're going to have to endure this wave of spread right now, and it's probably likely to be the biggest wave that we endure without the benefit of a vaccinated population. So we're going to have to rely on those mitigation steps. You're
talking to us from Connecticut. That's a state in the yellow zone. I know you plan to vote in person, but if you live in a red zone state, if you live in the Midwest right now, how safe is it to go out in the midst of an epidemic and vote?
Look, I think it's possible to protect yourself, but you're going to need to take precautions. You know, the biggest risk are the settings where we let our guard down. And when you talk to the governors about where the spread's occurring, it's occurring in congregate settings where people feel more comfortable, a local Elks Club, a large family gathering. I think when you go out to vote, the voting places are taking precautions. They're sequencing people carefully. They're cleaning the voting stations in between voters. Their lines are going to be long. but they're going to take precautions inside those settings. And I think when people go out to vote, if they wear a high-quality mask, they can adequately protect themselves. The biggest risk are the settings where we're not on guard, where we let our guard down, where we're not taking those kinds of precautions. So I think you can vote safely, even in places where there's high prevalence, but you're going to need to be careful.
And when you say high-quality mask, you mean not a cloth one. Is that right?
Right. Quality of mask matters. That's what the studies show. And so if you wear a procedure mask, that's going to protect you better. And if you're going to get N95 masks, that's even better.
When you said large family gatherings are a major source of spread, are you advising people not to celebrate Thanksgiving?
I think people need to weigh their individual risk. If you have people in your family who are vulnerable, I think it's advisable to try to continue to protect them. We have 2 or 3 very hard months ahead of us. I think this is probably going to be the hardest phase of this pandemic. The good news is that we have a lot of medical treatments and better medical care, so we're going to do a better job of preserving life. The bad news is I think we're going to end up infecting a lot more people. And so, we need to get through these next 2 to 3 months, and we've made it this far. I know people are exhausted, but we're in this about 8, 9 months now, and we have a short period of time to go. We're probably in the 7th inning of the acute phase of this pandemic right now. And
quickly, we keep hearing about these therapeutic breakthrough drugs. How widely available will they be, since we know there are likely shortages?
Well, they're going to have to be rationed. These are the therapeutic antibody drugs. They're going to have to be rationed, and I think there's going to be challenges distributing them. Right now, the plan is to distribute them at emergency rooms. So you're going to have to compel people who are largely well, people who have the infection but haven't yet really developed symptoms, because those are the people most likely to benefit, to come into an emergency room to get infused. That's going to be a challenge.
A challenge in the midst of a pandemic. All right, Dr. Gottlieb, thank you for your analysis and advice. And
Thanks a lot.
We'll be back in a moment. We want to go back now to the presidential campaign and check in with both sides. First, we go to the chairman of the Democratic Party, Tom Perez. Good morning to you.
Good morning. Pleasure to be with you.
Well, our CBS Battleground Tracker shows this morning that your candidate, Joe Biden, has the edge in both Arizona by 3 points, 5-point lead in Wisconsin. A lot of that, though, ultimately is going to be dependent on turnout. Do you think the Democratic Party has done enough in the midst of this pandemic to drive up either easy balloting or ability to go to the polls?
Well, I always caution people never get on the roller coaster. We take nothing for granted, and the enthusiasm, Margaret, has been all over the country. You saw the early vote totals in Wisconsin. Over a quarter of the people have already voted in Wisconsin. They voted absentee. You look down in Florida, 2.4 million people voted down there. And what's really interesting is the Democrats are overwhelmingly turning in their ballots, and 350,000 of the Democrats that have turned in their ballots haven't voted in the last 2 elections. So it's not just people who are voting for convenience, it's people who haven't turned out. And that shows the enthusiasm for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. We have a lot more work to do, but we're expanding the battlegrounds. We're competing in places like Arizona, Texas, Ohio, Iowa, Georgia, and elsewhere. And that's because we have a candidate who I think is just uniquely qualified to bring people together. He does have a plan to deal with our crisis, our coronavirus crisis, our economic crisis. He is a uniter. He's not a divider. And that is why Joe Biden is making the progress he's making. But we have more work to do, and folks got to get out there and vote.
Well, and the Biden campaign has emphasized that that lead is a lead, but it still could be neck and neck. And interestingly, when you look at our Arizona poll, the majority of likely voters in Arizona, 56%, give Democrats more blame than they do to Republicans or the president for not getting an economic relief package to them right now. I mean, Americans are in an economic emergency, and these negotiations remain more or less stalled on Capitol Hill. Do you think that strategy of holding out for a bigger, better deal is going to backfire for Democrats?
Well, it's the Democrats who passed a bill 5 or 6 months ago, and the Republicans did nothing. They're moving heaven and earth to fill a Supreme Court seat so they can undo the Affordable Care Act and undo coverage for people with pre-existing conditions.
But this is blame being
but they did next to
around
nothing.
to you now. This is backlash. These are what people are saying they see blame being put here with the Democrats in their view.
Well, in the last week, I've traveled both to Arizona, to Nevada, and to Florida. And what I've heard from voters throughout those travels, I was with folks in Orlando on Thursday, people working at Disney World. One person's she's going to lose her health care coverage on Thanksgiving Day. That's when she loses her health care. But the Republicans don't want to pay for COBRA coverage for people who've lost their coverage, who've lost their health care, they've lost their jobs. That's unconscionable. And people understand this is a health care election. In the middle of a crisis, we have a president who wants to undo coverage for people with pre-existing conditions. He wants to turn the clock back on health care. And it's the Democrats that have been fighting for it. And that's been a big sticking point in these negotiations.
But talking and doing are two different things, and not doing is what Democrats are getting blamed for here. But I want to ask you about when you're talking about get out the vote efforts. Yesterday, there was a court that ruled in Republicans' favor when it comes to a rule in Michigan about mail-in ballots needing to be returned by 8 p.m. on Election Day. This is a state that could really be decisive. How much of a setback is that?
Well, we've been organizing early in Michigan. We've been organizing early elsewhere. And in Wisconsin, for instance, back in April, the Republicans tried to weaponize the pandemic because they wanted to win a state Supreme Court case. And we won that case. We won it decisively because we out-hustled them. We out-organized them. We turned out absentee voters in droves. The same thing is happening in Michigan. Voters have options in Michigan thanks to a ballot initiative in 2018. And they're using those options. And you look at the early vote totals, and again, Democratic energy. And so we will continue to fight in courts. Well, I would rather, I believe democracy works better when everyone can cast their ballot and every ballot is counted. We're in an unprecedented pandemic here, and courts in other states have allowed votes that were postmarked by Election Day to be counted as long as they're received within a short period of time after Election Day. This court did it differently. I disagree categorically with that ruling, but we are moving ahead in Michigan. We're moving ahead everywhere. And again, the pandemic in Michigan, the pandemic everywhere, this is a crisis. People understand. This president has no plan. His closing argument in Michigan is lock her up. He's fanning the flames of division. He doesn't have a plan for the coronavirus. He doesn't have a plan for the economy. He's divisive. Joe Biden is bringing us together. People in Michigan remember that it was Joe Biden and Barack Obama who saved the auto industry when Republicans were letting it die. All
right. Tom Perez, thank you very much, Chairman. We're going to turn now to CBS News political analyst Reince Priebus, who was formerly Republican Party chairman. He was also the first White House chief of staff for President Trump, and he joins us from Kenosha, Wisconsin, his hometown, this morning. Good morning.
Good morning, Margaret.
Open up the Washington Post today. I see that you have, as they report, re-entered the Trump campaign mix. They say you're advising him on strategy, including coaching him in that recent NBC town hall. Says you are concerned about the president's chances. Is that right? You're concerned that the president is headed for a loss?
No, not at all. In fact, I'm not concerned about that at all. I'm concerned about early vote. I'm concerned about absentee ballot voting, but I'm always worried about early vote and absentee ballot voting. I haven't re-emerged. I've always been helpful to the president, helpful to the RNC. But look, you know, early vote and where we're at in a pandemic and having 5 times more people vote in Florida than ever before. These are unprecedented times. The polling is all over the map. This is something that's going to come down to the wire, and I hope and expect the president to win.
Well, what are the battleground states that you think he can win? Because as you heard from our poll, Joe Biden is at an advantage here.
Well, first of all, Margaret, I mean, these polls are really, really complicated to measure. I mean, what we have in this country, we have never seen before. We have regional, aside from, you know, working class white voters, suburban women, one of the other things that's going on in this country is that President Trump is winning in these rural parts of the country in unprecedented numbers. I mean, we have northern Wisconsin, that's like center Wisconsin to the north. President Trump won by 18 points in 2016. Today, he's pushing 30 points ahead in rural America with enthusiasm off the charts. Yes, it's a little bit down in the suburbs, but the hard thing for these pollsters, Margaret, as you bring up, is that they can't measure this kind of disparity between the rural parts of this country and what's happening in the suburbs.
So you think he's still going to win Wisconsin?
Well, I got to tell you, I saw the CBS poll this morning, and I'm not spinning you. I was slightly encouraged by it because in the Real Clear Politics average in Wisconsin in 2016, the president was actually down by 6.5 points, and he won. But also, Margaret, Gary Johnson got 106,000 votes as well in 2016. So Trump didn't just win Wisconsin in 2016 when they said he would lose by 6.5. He won, plus another conservative candidate got 106,000 ballots. So,
but one of the things,
you asked me,
one of the things though with Wisconsin that our Anthony Salvanto, our pollster, pointed out though is that base, that white non-college educated voter that came out strongly for the president back in 2016, that margin that is shrinking in terms of what we are seeing right now. Why do you think there is that erosion?
Well, I don't know if it's an erosion or not, Margaret. I mean, clearly, I think one of the things that you're going to see over the next couple of weeks is that the president's going to be pivoting, talking about the economy. I think this upcoming debate is going to be really important, that the president is likable, fun, have a good time, let Joe Biden speak, and let Joe Biden defend the Obama economy. Let him defend why ISIS was running wild and burning people in cages. Let Joe Biden defend why he was the one guy that didn't want to go forward with the Osama bin Laden raid. Let him defend the Iran deal. Those are the things that I think, pivoting to the economy, that those voters are going to be listening to. But, look, I think it's really complicated.
Well,
I don't think anyone can predict early vote and what's happening right now in this country.
It is hard to predict, and it is incredible that we are in the midst of a pandemic that is shaping so much, which is, how do you not address that, though? Do you really believe that there is not a political cost to the deaths that we are seeing in this country? I look at Wisconsin, where the president just had his rally, and the majority of likely Wisconsin voters tell us the response is going badly. 49% of them say the Trump administration has hurt Wisconsin's effort. So you think the president's hurting, not helping?
Well, I think it's going to be important for the president to remind everyone that it was he who shut down most travel from China. It was he who developed the task force. It was he that helped pass the CARES Act at $2 trillion 2 weeks after the country was shut down.
But hospitals are getting overwhelmed.
While, by the way,
now,
well, look, granted, Margaret, sure, no one likes what's going on in this country. No one likes that their kids are at home, and no one likes that a lot of these states are shut down by Democrat governors. That's all true. But the question is, would this person over here, Joe Biden, have done things better or differently? And I don't think Joe Biden's made that case. But the point is that I think that the upcoming debate is a great opportunity for the president to make that case to the American people. I think he's doing well in Wisconsin.
We will be watching. We'll see if he takes your advice. Thank you, Reince. We'll be right back.